There we go. Counselor Gonzalez.
Present. Good morning.
Present.
I see him.
Morning. Thank you. All right. Okay, Counselor Rosenthal.
Present.
And President Peterson is excused today. And Deputy Council President Wong.
Yep, present.
Uh,
Okay, well, before we begin our agenda items, can we please play the safety video for our in-person attendees?
if you flip
Oh, I never knew there was a switch up there.
Recording in progress.
Okay, so we'll move into our first item of business, which is the fiscal year 23-24 budget note report back. Each year, counselors may submit budget notes and amendments to provide policy direction not included in the proposed budget. In the fiscal year 23-24 budget, council adopted 7 budget notes. A short report on the progress for each budget note is included in your packet. If counselors have any questions about the report, we have Marisa Madrigal, our Chief Operating Officer, Brian Kennedy, Chief Financial Officer, and additional program staff are in attendance to answer questions specific to each individual budget note as needed. So I'll turn it over to Marisa.
Oh, thank you. My understanding is we don't have a presentation, but you do have the memo, and we are just available to answer any clarifying questions that you have about progress on the budget notes.
Colleagues, any questions on budget notes from last year?
I'll take some questions offline.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, the next item is a discussion on fiscal year 24-25 budget notes. Moving on to budget notes and amendments for the upcoming fiscal year 24-25 budget. I'll ask each counselor with a proposal to share brief descriptions of their budget notes or amendments. Following each description, please limit discussion to clarifying questions only. We'll have a substantive discussion on these notes on April 25th. To keep us on track, I'll call on counselors individually, and we also have staff available to provide additional information as needed. So first up, I can ask Counselor Simpson on any proposed budget notes or amendments.
Yes, I have 2 requests. One is to support the Portland State Transportation class. Metro will be taking over operating costs, which in the past were $41,000 for PBOT to run that class through PSU. $15,000 for facilitators, $15,000 for PSU faculty, staff, and grants student support, and $11,000 for staff time that would likely be Metro staff. But there are options to have a partnership with PBOT in this. PBOT supported this class for many years, but due to financial constraints, it was removed from their budget for the next fiscal year. Taking this on would demonstrate and increase Metro's leadership in building knowledge in the region, with room for Metro to decide what would work best for us in terms of how this course is led. For example, there's an opportunity for Metro to take over the leadership of this class or to continue to work with PBOT staff on the leadership aspect. This class aligns with Metro's transportation and regional planning work and positively impacts the communities in which we serve. And I'll stop there to take any comments, questions before I move on to the next note.
Counselor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Joe Hong. Just what is the content of the class? I mean, can you give me what its purpose is? I'm not familiar with it.
Yep, so this is a class where transportation planners, students, engineers, transportation traffic engineers, planners, urban planners, as well as community development students come in and we talk through transportation frameworks, planning frameworks, but then we also invite guests to come and speak. And so this last term, I spoke in that class with Rakaya Adams over at the 1803 Fund, and we talked a bit about how transportation has impacted the albino community, but in a larger sense, I talked about transportation as a region in terms of planning and things with those students.
And it includes all modes of transportation, multimodal and as well as roads and.
I was very, very clear about the multimodal pedestrian.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Good idea.
Counselor Simpson, did you have a second budget
Yes.
amendment? Okay.
My second is to support Greater Portland, Inc. They are looking to do a workforce gap analysis, and I'd like to help support them in their effort. Right now, they are at the very beginning stages, so I would say step 0. And it would be useful for us to get involved with the process now and dedicate some Metro staff time to help with the project development of something like this. And I'm seeking about 20 to 30 hours of staff time to consult with GPI as they explore the possibility of this work.
Questions on that? Counselor Lewis?
Staff time only, no direct funding.
For now, yes, staff time.
Counselor Nolan?
Not so much to you, but maybe to Marisa or Brian. We could end up with a document that has hundreds of budget notes if every time a good idea that a counselor or even a majority of the council wants to suggest be done has to be specifically directed. Is there a guideline for that? I mean, I like the idea. I'm not quarreling, and I like the idea of the PSU class, but they're very precise, one might say tiny expenditures that I would think that the council wouldn't have to direct with a budget note.
Thank you for that question, Councilor Nolan. I think what we're trying to do in creating more transparency with budget notes and council direction is one, just being very transparent about what staff is being asked to do, how much time is being spent on different things. Because while it may seem tiny, there are 7 of you, and staff when we don't receive direction from council as a group, we can often receive conflicting direction or direction that spirals or grows. And then we are dedicating Metro resources potentially out of alignment with where the council is. So I think the guideline that we have used in the past when asking staff for assistance is, anything that takes more than a few hours should either be funneled through me or should be directed at the council level. So.
Follow up a few hours. And that's where I'm having some difficulty. I assume, well, yes, I can also understand that having 7 people say, I want you to spend the next 2 days doing this means that we don't actually have a distinction between legislative and executive functions. I'll just say that $20,000, $40,000 seems to be a very low threshold.
Noted. Thank you.
One thing I might add, Councilor Nolan, Brian Kennedy, CFO, is for items that specifically request appropriation of funds, those should be structured as a budget amendment, whereas a budget note is designed to give direction to staff. So if you're seeking to direct dollars to a specific program or project, that should be a budget amendment because that is materially changing the budget.
Counselor Gonzalez.
Thanks, Counselor Wong. I just had a question in the similar vein to what Counselor Nolan mentioned. Because Marisa, what you mentioned feels like I'm just trying to wrap my mind around the kind of the process. And I mean, if we want to update our practices as a council, then I think that's good. And we've done some of that work over this last year with some of the council office work. But you know, is the expectation for these budget notes to only come up during budget season? Because I mean, I've never had a budget note kind of recommending council throughout my 6 years on the council outside of budget season that I can recollect right now. And so I think it would be helpful for us to explore maybe some standardization about, you know, bring something to the council or talking to you. Those are very different, you know, like in terms of affirmation. And I'm sure that you probably feel, you know, part of your job is managing that tension of how do you prioritize all these asks from us. But in general, I'm just wondering how, you know, this budget note that Councillor Simpson is moving forward, like the kind of precedent or the kind of practice or standards it can set for us moving forward. And if that's what we agree on as a council, or and also Councillor Simpson, I'm sure is just kind of like, there's an idea, we're in this process, I'm going to move this forward because we're in this process. But for me, it's begging like a larger question, wanting to ask a larger question and see what folks think there about that. So again, thanks.
Great. Let's go with Counselor Rosenthal and then Lewis.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Something I'm confused about. Since we haven't approved a budget yet, are we in the stage of budget amendments or are we still just developing the budget? This is a question for Brian. I mean, I'm a little, I understand we have to amend it once it's adopted, but then we're pre-approval and then there's the approval adoption period. So it's sort of like.
So under Oregon local budget law, it's good question, Councilor Rosenthal. So the COO presents the proposed budget. So what you are deliberating on now is the proposed budget. To the extent the council wants to change it, that requires a budget amendment. Typically, so under Oregon local budget law, the budget goes through 3 phases: proposed, approved, adopted. You can make changes between proposed and approved or approved and adopted. We typically don't do many changes between proposed and approved. The schedule right now is that the council on, I believe, May 2nd will approve the budget, transmit it to the Tax Supervising and Conservation Commission. And then between that time, then council will continue to deliberate on any potential budget amendments. There will also be amendments, relatively small number coming from staff to account for things that were missed in the development or things that have changed since that time. So basically, we're trying to have this conversation where council has enough time to have those deliberations prior to adopting the budget in mid-June.
So we have 3 phases of amendments to the proposal, amendments to the approved, and amendments to the adopted.
And those typically happen 3 times during the
okay.
fiscal year.
All right.
Counselor Lewis.
Sure, thank you. Colleagues, I've had a couple of conversations over the past couple of weeks, both with our council president and our chief operating officer. I think what we're facing in this exact conversation is representative of a larger struggle that we're facing as a council, where we wish to have better muscles when it comes to our legislative authority, which is both through our home rule charter and granted through state statutes. And we don't have muscle memory. We don't have the small muscles to build the big muscles on doing legislative work outside of the budget. That is the one place where we know we can go and get something that we want accomplished. So some of these questions we're asking maybe a little bit cart before the horse. For instance, not to pick on you, Councilor Simpson, you just went first. You're talking about an investment in transportation. We haven't had the discussion about the transportation budget yet to even know what grant programs, what flexible funds are within that department budget. And then secondarily, we're looking at this as our one shot to get all of our objectives across the line. So I think we're gonna have to take this moment of being a little bit in free fall and state our priorities. But overall, my hope is that this budget includes a staff person and the appropriate resources so that our office and the COO office is staffed so that we can actually do policy, write legislation as a body and move it through this agency in a way that a legislative body does, not just a board of directors getting reports, getting roll-up information. I'd like us to act a whole lot more like a legislature and less like a board of directors.
Great, thanks for the comments. Any other clarifying questions for Councilor Simpson? All right, seeing none, next up, can I ask Councilor Lewis to present any proposed budget notes you might have?
Sure. I have several budget priorities, and I'm gonna go through them in kind of an arbitrary order. First, I will be presenting an arts funding amendment. That amendment will start by removing $25,000 of funding to the Regional Arts and Culture Council from the council discretionary budget. I would like to replace it with $150,000 of investment in council discretionary funding for performing arts grants. I would like to focus on performing arts organizations that use our halls at P5. Second, I would like to have a budget note around reuse and WPES. I was delighted to hear that the pilot will hopefully be using already existing facilities at Metro and leveraging them for reuse. But I would like to use this note to ask the department to come back by November, no later than November, with an allocation of funds, either suggested new revenue or unexpended funds from the accounts that would be relevant to invest in reuse. Then I would also like to bring forward an amendment. It would be structured similar to an amendment that I had 2 years ago with the unallocated general fund reserve for capital, and bring that into a climate resilience framework with a focus on climate justice and resilience on Metro's property. Then I also have a couple of notes down that are not fully formed because we haven't seen all of those budget presentations yet. I have a priority on making sure we fully fund our investments through Parks and Nature in Willamette Falls. I have a priority of making sure that our tree canopy investment, which I've heard briefly described, but we haven't seen a full presentation on, covers the entire region and meets us at this moment that we're in, where we know tree canopy investments are already too delayed. And then lastly, I'd like to have a budget note asking for staff support in a task force exploring the future of a Washington Park full loop zoo train.
Could you repeat that last one?
Zoo train.
Oh, zoo train.
Great, thanks, Councilor Lewis. Any clarifying questions? I saw Councilor Rosenthal.
Yeah, on the issue where you mentioned the allocation of money for the climate resilience, I was a little unclear. Is that meant to develop a report for how we make our metro facilities more resilient, or was it intended to go beyond that?
It's not meant to be a report function. It's meant to actually make the investments in the capital improvement program that we already have spelled out. We just don't have the dollars to fully implement. So a few years ago, we helped electrify our fleet, for instance. So I'd like to continue those investments.
So it could be like solar panels on Expo or things like that. Okay, all right.
Yes.
Specific things. Okay, great.
Councilor Nolan, did you have a follow-up?
I did. I appreciate and support the concept of your arts redirection. And I understand investing in organizations that use our facilities, but I think that might be a bit short-sighted in respect to our racial justice value. And I would like to work with you, put it out there that I think some of those, if the council approves your additional funds, some of them should be earmarked or prioritized for locally led, BIPOC-led arts organizations.
Many of which use our facilities.
Some do, not all. And our facilities, as we know, are beyond the reach of some of the small arts organizations, and I don't think we want to leave, I would not like to leave them out. So just some way of adjusting that.
Okay.
While we're talking about collaborating, I also have some interest in the facility at the zoo train and whether we prioritize the capital and operating expenses there. So I'd just like to talk with you about that and see if we can find some common ground. So those are in response to what you had. Thanks for bringing them forward.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, and I also want to just echo the comments that Councillor Lewis made about our struggle as a council to really grab onto our legislative role and finding mechanism that we can use the budget to support policies, but also coordinate with the chief operating officer's office so that we really do fulfill our charge to legislate policy. And I think the budget is the biggest policy document we pass every year, with the executive implementing it. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Great. Any other clarifying questions for Councilor Lewis? No. Okay, let's move on to Councilor Rosenthal. Proposed budget notes.
All right, you're not gonna go? I was told I was last. All right. I think there's been a lot of good ideas here. I think the issue that we floundered with last year was on how to develop budget notes and budget concepts is a critical one. And I agree with Councilor Lewis that we need to move more into something where we have sort of some legislative intent. I have two sets of concerns or issues. One is what you might call concepts, most of which are being worked on in one sense or another, some of which I submitted as budget notes last year and which are being worked on. And I'll just go through those very briefly just to talk about the ideas. And they're being percolated at various levels within staff at this point in time. And I haven't determined exactly whether more support is needed or whether it's something that'll work its way out. So I'll just, that's a list of one thing. And then I have two specific budget notes that I think that I would like to just discuss in a little bit more detail. First of all, power line trails. We have a trail system and we have a goals of more trails, and we know we can put some power line trails, but we haven't prioritized the areas or locations, and that's an ongoing thing. Regional wetland prioritization, several issues have come up with guarding wetlands that are not on our key location. The 24 priorities for parks and recreations, yet they're important. That's something that really is more of a state process. AI policy development is something we all know that AI is here to stay and that we probably are going to have policies. I suspect that our IT people are already working on that, so I'm not proposing anything specific. The single point Portland Council contact, which I have suggested, is we know that Portland's going to go through transitions. And we need some sort of point that really has some consistent representation of where the Portland Council is going on certain things, because we're going to have a lot of new people. I proposed last year a plastics reduction initiative such that we develop some technical guidance on how we can further plastics reductions or plastics recycling or reuse in some ways. So that's pretty much ongoing and it's being evaluated. It was included in the budget notes. There's also the upgrade of, transportation vision and upgrade of the the RTP with potential amendments. That's something that is in the process, as well as with the 2040 growth concept refresh. And then Councilor Lewis mentioned the reuse, recycle initiative request to get more specifics on how we can, stimulate this by November. So those are a bunch of just concepts that are being worked on. The two that I really want to highlight that I think are actually much more important than that are two. One is to develop a regional tolling proposal, because I think that we're the only entity that can do that. The ODOT and OTC will wait until the legislative directive, and they'll get legislative directives in 25, but by then it'll be too late. We know that we conducted a study some years ago that said that regional tolling is something that should be done regionally, not just in piecemeal or incremental. And yet ODOT had pursued a piecemeal incremental approach. We have the capacity to do this. This will probably require some additional full-time equivalents. I'm not sure that we have the current staff to actually focus on this, to come up with a proposal, or come up with at least a concept plan between now and now and say October, November, when it's time you start talking to legislators about what they're putting on the table. This would be something that would analyze both the concept of tolling regionally, how the values, how it would impact regional equity, economic equity, how the revenues could be generated and distributed, and possibly even what legislative enhancements might be necessary to make it actually work. And also what the stakeholders should be involved. This is something that tolling has, something that's probably going to be, at least in the near future, is only going to happen in this regional area. Not in other parts of the state, and it's a mechanism for finding for additional funding where we know we're losing funding from the gas tax. It's been flat. It's not going down yet, but it's flat. The second proposal is a proposal to do the same thing, because it's the alternative form for revenue generation for transportation, and that would be an analysis, at least a preliminary conceptual analysis of the implementation barriers for both a regional as well as a statewide vehicle mile tax. It's a complicated process. It's necessary to have both that and tolling proposals for the region to understand the differences in their economic impacts, the impacts on people, regional equity, and how much money that would bring for projects. We do know that regionally we have the largest number of projects statewide, the significant projects, whether it's the Highway 26 or the Boone Bridge or the Interstate Bridge or the Abernathy Bridge. There are a lot of, or the Albina Cover, there are a lot of projects regionally that are very expensive, and we don't really have a good, and we could also talk about the Southwest Corridor, Max Line, which we planned and do not have the money to build. So I think it's something that Metro as an entity is the only entity in the position to do that. The state has other concerns, and statewide perspectives, of course. And so I think that these are areas that we need to pursue. And I would be proposing budget amendments to add FTEs in both of these areas, and with the direction and also some money for consulting support, so that we can at least start setting the stage for conversations, which will happen in and during the legislative session. And we know that it's going to focus on basically transportation issues and long-term funding. So those are two that I have fleshed out, and I have a document that basically a budget note on those that I can submit to all the counselors.
Great. Thank you, Councilor Rosenthal. Any clarifying questions? Councilor Nolan.
I have several questions about the last one you just mentioned, Councilor Rosenthal. It meshes with my objective that we really have in-house the capacity to understand the climate, greenhouse gas, as well as racial justice implications of individual transportation projects that run through our system, most particularly through the JPAC, Counselor Gonzalez. And that's a subset of what you're proposing, which is to create a funding mechanism to influence that behavior. A VMT tax would be both to support capital investment operations of the transportation system, but from the conversations this council has been clear about, it would also be designed to influence the behavior. So I have questions. Once I see the proposal, I'll want to follow up, but there are good kernels of innovation in what you've described this morning.
Be happy to have further
We've
discussions.
talked already, but I'd
Well,
like
yeah.
to see it in writing.
Great. Additional questions?
Counselor Gonzalez has his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Counselor Gonzalez.
Thanks, Deputy President Wong. Yeah, Councilor Rosenthal, you and I have had the opportunity to talk about this at length. So I just wanted to bring some of those questions to the rest of the council for the public discourse here. But for the proposals that you talk around tolling and requesting a dedicated FTE, I'm wondering for the scope of your project proposal, because that's the first time I hear about the FTE request. So I'm curious to hear about how that might work with the work plans that the planning department has, but I'm sure they'll respond to us. Is the scope of the note that you're talking about of developing a proposal that we advance in the 2025 legislature, or is it more so like a hiring a consultant to understand what the field looks like? So that's my first question. And my second question is, for an area like this, for us to design a system that we don't own or implement, I mean, it just feels like there's a disconnect that needs to be addressed. Either, as this note moves along the process, but my big questions will continue to be, there's what external agencies, are a part of this project or are helping to really land the plane here, since, we do need to have a really strong connection and alignment with the work that's happening. And lastly, if we're aiming and working on policy to be developed between now and the 25 session or session in the future, then, I think it's also important to have a general sense of, talking with either legislators that are in transportation leadership or agency leads to really understand where the money will make the most impact, and I think for me, I'm trying to figure out, an investment of this scale of an FTE plus consultants over the next year or two to design something which we don't really quite know what the legislative session is really even going to cover. It feels like it could be, spending a lot of resources that might not really fit the like a square peg into a round hole kind of thing. So anyway, just a bit some scattered thoughts there. I know you and I have had the opportunity to talk at length about this, but I think there's a lot of questions that I continue to have, and we'll need to continue to review and put them through the tests of the budget process. But anyway, thanks.
Sure, if I might just comment, sort of the concept is based upon two things. One is the original study we did that said that we need a sort of a regional concept when it comes to tolling, because to do it on a piecemeal basis is going to cause additional difficulties. And the second part is based on the values that we developed prior to adoption of the RTP, where we came up with a set of values for what regional tolling would look like. So the first idea is to come up with just what would a regional tolling plan look like that meets our values, which is, economic equity, regional equity, avoidance of diversion, more enhancement of transit, et cetera, et cetera. What would that look like? ideally. And the second concept is some of these things are things that we probably don't have and do not want to get in staff to hire. For example, do some analysis of cost elasticity. In other words, the impact of different toll levels on people's perceptions is something that, would be, or an analysis of what the real feasibility costs would be for actually implementing and operating and maintaining this. We've heard some numbers and obviously it's been very controversial. ODOT has said, well, they're going to have to take 40% of any tolling for operation and maintenance. And I think that we would need an analysis, and that would require some technical skills and people to look at what's going on in the rest of the world. And that would probably be something that be beyond what our current staff capacity would have in mind. So that would be consulting aspects. So, but I'm happy to engage in further conversations. And the other point I guess I want to make is it is true that we may not get this far in this 2025 legislature. But I think these are issues that are not going to go away. We have to pay for the road systems we have, and we have to try and find ways to reduce both travel by cars and greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're in the regional driver's seat for being a convener and a discussion generator so that we can try and address these. And I think we can probably be more effective than some of the state agencies.
Councilor Lewis?
Sure, thank you. I guess I'm curious, how at this point we would be able to do this by going alone. We are at a position where we try to be collaborative with other agencies who are holding the tolling. But what other agencies do you think would need to work with us in order to be successful as part of this program you're proposing?
Well, eventually we would have to work with virtually all of our stakeholders. Initially, just to come up with what our values, we came up with our values on our own, and to identify what an ideal system might look like, I think we can do in-house without involving a great number of stakeholders. But remember, it's for discussion purposes. It's sort of to put up something that other people can throw darts at, or throw bombs at, or apples or oranges or whatever you want to throw at it. If you don't have a regional concept, then you end up with dealing with each thing in a piecemeal basis. The tolling that was proposed by ODOT really had basically nothing to do with congestion. It had to do with bridge building. And so it started the narrative in a difficult way because it really didn't address the regional concepts. So at some point, after we developed what we would think might value our values, we would obviously want to be involved with ODOT, with OTC, and with our legislators, and talk to them about what their concepts are and what they think their constituents need. But that probably would come in the second phase, in my view.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Okay. Gosh, just for myself, I didn't have any specific budget notes or amendments. I was pleased to see ongoing support for our climate task force, continuing our civic engagement grants at the DEI program, and also continuing funding for our work with public-private partnerships. So glad to see those in the CO's budget. And I don't have any notes myself, but I do see we have 10 budget notes presented today, and we'll have more substantive conversation on those on the 25th. I'm looking forward to that. Okay, last major item is department budget presentation from our planning, development, and research team.
Councilor Wong?
Counselor, there's.
Oops.
Oh, do we have a question from Councilor Gonzalez?
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. You might be going off the script and want to make sure we all have the chance to talk about budget items.
Yes.
So I in particular don't have a budget note for this section, so it makes sense. But I just wanted to echo like what you mentioned. the climate task force work that was spearheaded through some budget notes in the past that Councilor Wong and I have been working for. I want to thank Marisa and the team for finding resources that we'll be able to allocate into the next phase of the agency and the work there, not requiring a budget note. And so I just also wanted to express my appreciation for Metro's commitment to that climate task force work. And then yeah, I think I'll leave it at that, but I just wanted to make sure we had the chance to share some thoughts around that.
Great. Thank you, Councilor Gonzalez. Okay, now we're going to move on to a budget presentation from Planning, Development, and Research. And we have Catherine Ciarlo from the Planning, Development, and Research team.
Thank you, Deputy President Wong and council members and Marisa. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk to you about the budget that we've proposed through Marisa. I'm Catherine Ciarlo. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Planning, Development, and Research Department. I'm here to talk to you about our budget, and with me are Malou Wilkinson, our deputy director of the department, and Rachel Lembo, our finance manager. And so we're going to share the presentation among us a little bit. Next slide, please. Just starting out, you all know this, but the Planning, Development, and Research Department convenes regional partners around a range of land use and transportation issues and programs. We plan for growth in the region, which includes managing the urban growth boundary and ensuring an adequate supply of land for housing and industrial development. We serve as the Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, for federal funds to flow through the region for transportation investments. Our research center collects, analyzes, and communicates data to guide work and investments both within Metro and working for our regional partners. And we bring community and regional government partners together to create programs and grants that support equitable development. So it's a broad range of work. Always a challenge to bring that breadth here, but we've tried to do it in kind of a sample way. Next slide, please. So the topics we were asked to talk about are there on the left. In the context of talking about these, I'm excited to share with you all the progress we've made over the past year and some of the upcoming priorities and actions for the coming year. Next slide, please. Just a little summary of our department investment progress over the past year. These are things that our department either completed or moved forward. Again, not a comprehensive list, but what we wanted to choose here were things that really are examples of our multidisciplinary work across different parts of the department. So as you can see, we adopted the Regional Transportation Plan. We refined the 2040 Planning Grant Awards and gave 17 grants to 10 jurisdictions. As we move toward the 2024 growth management decision later this year, we brought new voices into the process by convening an urban growth roundtable and a youth cohort to help inform that discussion. Our team won 2 major grants, federal grants, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant from EPA and the Safe Streets for All grant from the Federal Highway Administration. Our research center completed a Regional Land Information System, or ARLIS, survey of our internal departments and our partners. The idea there being, let's understand what the priorities for this GIS-based data tool are. And we actually got a good sense of what some of the priorities and uses of that tool are. And you might not be tracking everything that ARLIS is used for. So I'm going to give you a couple examples because I think these are fascinating. The City of Portland uses our canopy layer in their Tree Canopy Explorer. TriMet uses ARLIS Streets to help route its paratransit vehicles. ODOT uses our list to contact property owners impacted by their projects, and the list goes on and on. So you get a sense of how integrated into the region's thinking about itself and priorities and investments that database is. And then we updated the social vulnerability tool in the past year to identify barriers that prevent vulnerable communities from receiving emergency services during natural disasters. Again, just a sampling of the work, but we tried to pull things that show some of the breadth and some of the progress. And what we're hoping to communicate with these examples is the multidisciplinary nature of the work, its impact on community. This is work that is very focused on the communities we serve, and the fact that it's centered on equity and sustainability and climate. Next slide, please. So I think this is a good place for us to thank you all for the modifications and additional investments you approved for inclusion in the 24 budget. And we just wanted to report back on some of those investments. It included 3 new FTE, which are listed up there. Each of these positions expands our ability to really collaborate across Metro and support programs both within our agency and with our partners. Our new equity manager is working with the DEI department and the HR department to improve processes and equity outcomes, and she will also update our equity strategy as a department. Our new admin team member will provide extra support for the Data and Research Center. I shared a couple of their actions and priorities for last year. And our community investments manager is partnering with the COO's office on the social innovation program, as well as a number of other equitable investment programs. So it just gives you a flavor. Thank you. We've put those positions to good work. And all of those positions were informed by feedback from our Budget Equity Committee, which recommended these types of actions and additional support for the work. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Lembo for an overview of our budget. Thanks.
We can go to the next slide. Good morning, I'm Rachel Lembo. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the finance manager for the Planning Development Research Department. And as Catherine said, we're now going to switch gears to talk about the FY25 proposed budget. Our FY25 proposed budget includes $49.3 million in resources, both from new revenues and use of fund balance. This slide breaks that revenue down by division within our department. In PD&R, the bulk of our revenue comes from grants. Our primary transportation grants include federal MPO funds for transportation planning, regional flexible fund allocations for our regional travel options grant program and transit corridors, and competitive grants we've been awarded for climate pollution reduction and safe streets for all. These provide funding to the transportation, research, investment areas, and community investments divisions. Urban policy and development funding primarily comes from the construction excise tax, which funds our 2040 grant program, and a fund exchange with TriMet to fund the transit-oriented development program. In FY25, this also includes $5 million from the state of Oregon for TOD investments along 82nd Avenue. Over 80% of our funding is restricted, the green portion on the chart. The unrestricted portion, shown in red, is our general fund allocation, which we use for land use planning, non-grant funded programs such as community placemaking and economic investments, agency-wide research support, and for the required match on grants. Next slide, please. This slide looks at how those revenues are spent, again by division. Our budget is primarily personnel, the red portion of the chart, and grant programs, which are reflected in materials and services, the green portion. Our grant programs invest funding into our community, primarily in transportation and urban policy and development, where you can see the materials and services budgets are much larger. Transportation includes $3.8 million for the Regional Travel Options Grant Program, and urban policy and development includes $3.3 million for the 2040 grant program and $11 million for TOD grants and land purchases. Indirect costs account for department leadership and the Central Services Cost Allocation Plan and are shown allocated across all divisions. Next slide, please. Our department has 89 FTE allocated across the divisions as shown here. This includes 3 proposed new positions, which we'll review in just a moment, and 6 existing communications and engagement staff who directly support PD&R, which will shift from into PD&R from the Central Communications Department in FY25. With that, I'll pass it back to Catherine.
Thanks, Rachel. Next slide, please. So PD&R is no stranger to performance measurement. Our department's work is guided by a number of policies and documents, from Metro's 2040 vision to individual council priorities, not individuals on council, but over the years, collections of council. Regional partner agreements negotiated around the JPAC table, grant commitments, and the need to fulfill federal, state, and regional planning and funding requirements. So each of these comes with its own set of performance expectations and reporting requirements. We're very consistent and motivated to meet those in many cases, because that's what allows us to keep receiving the money that we spend in the region. That said, for purposes of this work, we tried to really grab onto this performance measures idea. We listened to what you all have talked about and tried to come up with something cross-cutting and a little bit broader than the type of performance measures I just talked about that can really help us measure progress over time. So we chose the 2 that you see here to kind of do that. And both need more work, but we wanted to share them with you here. The first is the number of multimodal projects advanced by Metro funding or participation. Those may well end up needing to be ranked or weighted by size, since if we're doing number of projects, enormous project like the Division Transit improvement is a different scale and a different level of investment than, say, a suburban sidewalk or bike project. But all of that reflects the progress we're making toward livable communities, toward climate outcomes, and toward mobility. So that we're looking forward to doing some work with our partners to be able to count those. The next one we've looked at is density and development in 2040 centers. Again, we're continuing to work on metrics, but a couple of examples of what we're thinking about here would be people per acre, or jobs or businesses per acre, to look at the vibrancy of centers, the number of 2040 grants granted in centers, the number of transportation-oriented development projects completed in centers or funded in centers, the number of permits or new construction in centers versus outside of centers, maybe looking at an overlay of higher density projects in multimodal areas. So we're doing more work on that. We expect to nail those down and narrow them down over the course of the year. But we're excited about being able to show, with respect to the 2040 vision, that Metro's policies and investments really are helping us create a community where we are not growing out, but we're focusing investments on places where we can actually leverage the impact of those investments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Malou to talk about the equity metric that you asked us to present on.
All right, so hello again, I'm Malou Wilkinson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Planning Development and Research Department. Next slide, please. Meaningful engagement is one of the 5 goals of Metro's strategic plan to advance racial equity. And we've really been focused in our department on bringing people of color into our decision-making processes in all of the work across our department. This helps to shape decisions, timelines, and outcomes. An example of where we're doing this is applying an equity lens to our urban growth management work, as Catherine referred to earlier this year. We've been going to Metro's Committee on Racial Equity, and we've also asked members of CORE to serve on the Urban Growth Report Roundtable, and we've convened a youth cohort to bring new perspectives into our growth management analysis to help better inform the decisions that you'll be asked to make later this year. Over the past few years, PDNR is intentionally invested in participant compensation as one of the ways that we can lower barriers to engagement for individuals and community-based organizations for offering their time to participate and share their perspectives. The amount of compensation and the number of recipients really varies each year based on project work, but our department is continuing to focus on the outcome of creating engagement and participation structures that empower people of color. And you can see on the slide that it kind of goes up and down depending on the number of committees that we have. Next slide, please. Also wanted to talk a bit about our investments in target areas. The work of planning, development, and research supports all three of the strategic targets that council developed last year and several of the implementation strategies. Three bodies of work that we'll be focusing on in the next year are what I will highlight here today. One effort that will support meeting our climate and resilience goals is our last mile transit planning work. As part of implementing the regional transportation plan, we'll work with partners to create a strategy that helps connect high capacity transit lines to riders' final destinations and to identify needed transit services in communities where high capacity transit does not yet exist. In addition to helping to reduce vehicle miles traveled, this planning can improve mobility for underserved communities, and it supports more economically vibrant neighborhoods and business districts. A program that will support Housing for All is our transit-oriented development program. TOD projects provide affordable housing located near transit that helps spur the market to create similar projects. Since 1998, the program has invested over $40 million along Greater Portland's transit system, supporting the construction of almost 7,000 housing units in these areas. Last, an example of how our work will support a resilient economy for all includes an industrial land and freight movement study. This work will support investments to encourage industrial development in alignment with the efficient movement of goods. And again, these are just a few examples of how our work in the upcoming year will support the council's strategic targets. And I'll turn it back to Rachel.
Next slide, please. I'll now highlight changes in the FY25 budget. The first change is an increase to our general fund allocation. As you remember from the resources slide, most of our funding is restricted, and we rely on general fund allocation for programs that don't receive external funding and for required match for grants. During the pandemic, our general fund allocation was decreased as costs were reduced. At this point, our costs have mostly recovered. We and the central services departments have rehired staff from the pandemic reductions, and we've grown in new ways. However, our general fund allocation was still below where it would have been without the pandemic reduction. You can see this on the green line on the chart. In addition, our costs have increased to a point where even our pre-pandemic track, in that wonderful universe where the pandemic didn't happen, which you can see as the red line on the chart, wouldn't be sufficient for us to maintain our current work. As a result, the proposed budget includes a general fund allocation increase of $2.25 million, bringing us to $9.1 million, shown on the chart in blue. This will allow us to continue the work we're currently doing without cost reductions. I'll pass it to Malou to discuss the other modifications.
Next slide, please. So this proposed budget includes one-time general fund resources for 4 important bodies of work that we are really excited to be able to do. Well, one is not quite as exciting as what Rachel just talked about, but the grants themselves are really exciting. So the first budget modification in the proposed budget, we've, as you heard from Catherine and from Rachel, we've received higher than normal levels of grants for FY25. Those grants require match. And so the budget includes $320,000 to cover that additional local grant match. The second budget modification was developed in collaboration with the COO's office. It is $200,000 to develop a regional data assessment of current and potential cooling corridors, as well as strategies to further improve our region's resilience in the face of continued prolonged extreme heat events, as we experience the impacts of global climate change in our region. And this also helps to inform the update to a 2040 vision. Since this concept of cooling corridors is relatively new for our region, we plan to engage outside subject matter experts to help support the work, as well as coordinate with the Parks and Nature Department. Extreme heat impacts people of color and low-income communities harder than others. So we've included funds to support CBO engagement throughout the process to help ensure that the data and implementation strategies are developed and refined to help support equity outcomes. Our third budget modification is a shared ask with the Housing Department. And I'm going to take just a little bit more time on this one to address some of the questions that were asked during the Housing Department budget presentation. We've been in a housing crisis in our state for a few years, we all know. And to respond to this, the state legislature adopted the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis legislation in 2019 with House Bill 2003 and provided further direction in 2021 and 2022. Later this year, the state will produce housing targets. There are numbers of units for every city and urban unincorporated area in the region. Then cities and counties will produce housing production strategies with actions to achieve that production target. Metro will not be receiving a target from the state, but we do have responsibilities. We're required by this legislation, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, to produce a regional housing coordination strategy 1 year after an urban growth management decision and every 6 years after that. This is the first time that we've had to do this. This strategy must include a list of actions, including the adoption of measures and policies or coordinating actions that Metro will undertake to promote the development and maintenance of diverse housing types that are high quality, physically accessible, and affordable, with access to economic opportunities, services, and amenities, as well as actions that affirmatively further fair housing. PDNR is really focused on the production of all housing in the region, while the Housing Department is more focused on housing for those most in need. We both need data and information about the population and housing production trends, so we're coordinating on data collection, and we both need to understand each other's findings and priorities, as well as communicate with our local partners throughout the process. So we're partnering on this work, and we've established regular coordination meetings, which will continue in the upcoming fiscal year and presumably after that. The development of the regional housing coordination strategy is expected to take 18 months. Our budget includes $300,000 for a technical consultant. 50% of that was in the Housing Department's proposed budget, and an additional $35,000 for engagement and facilitation. That's why you see $185,000 in our proposed budget. This partnership is really critically important to us, that we coordinate and do this work together. Our last budget modification includes $100,000 to support early scoping and engagement for a 2040 plan update. We've been hearing from many of you, from regional partners, from the business community and community-based organizations, about the need for a future vision that is in sync with the world we live in today, not 30 years ago. In the coming year, we'll begin the scoping update based on input from the council in collaboration with the COO, with our sister departments, and with regional partners. It's critical to include that participation from our business and CBO leaders to get their ideas to incorporate as well. We'll need to think through elements that were not front and center when our vision was created in the 1990s. These include racial equity, climate, equitable development, and a stronger focus on housing. And this work will really kick off following Council's growth management decision at the end of 2024, and will focus on early engagement, CBO involvement, and learning from other regions to inform next steps. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. In addition to the general fund request that Rachel described and the one-time request that Malou walked us through, just wanted to share our proposal for the addition of 3 additional FTE positions as part of this budget, 2 of which are actually already funded by grant revenues. Actually, we can stay with this slide. The research program director will fill a leadership gap created by the merger a couple of years ago with between PDNR and the research center. Since that time, we have been struggling with something of a leadership gap. There's a lot of capacity that's missing just to help those 3 managers and 24 employees really think strategically and do the kinds of work that we described earlier and make the kinds of partnerships. This new program director would provide leadership to help that group thrive and grow and continue to provide cutting edge work both within and outside of Metro. That is the only position that would receive a general fund increase, and that is actually part of the ask, I think, that Rachel described earlier. No,
It's separate.
sorry, that is separate. Then the additional 2 FTE are an associate planner to support the climate pollution reduction grant we described earlier. That is really a coordination effort working with local governments in the region to develop plans and a comprehensive climate strategy. And then an assistant planner to support the regional travel options program, which among other things will enable the RTO program to operationalize its recently completed equity implementation strategy. That, like the climate pollution reduction grant position, would be funded out of grant revenues. Next slide, please. That brings us to the end of our presentation to you. We welcome questions. Happy to talk with you about ideas that you have. Mostly we want to thank you. This is an incredibly engaged group of people in our work. I don't think there's anyone around this table that I haven't talked to many, many, many times in the past year, and you make our work better. We really appreciate you, and happy to answer questions and talk about, as I say, ideas moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, team. Colleagues, any questions? Okay, let's go with Councilor Rosenthal and Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. 2 quick questions. First of all, and I might have some larger comments later, but the quick questions are cooling corridors. Does that include just like tree-lined streets or also connectivity between parks, between parklands? I mean, Forest Park is a cooling corridor, of course. So I'm just wondering if how broad that definition is. And then when it comes to the regional housing coordination strategy, will that include the regional housing plans for the non-metro communities that actually are part of our economic watershed? In other words, whether it's Woodburn, which is building a lot of houses and has jobs, but also sends a lot of people up this way, or Newburgh, et cetera, et cetera. Will it include some coordination or interchange of information with those surrounding communities?
How about I field questions? And I think first I'm going to ask Malou to address the cooling corridors question, and then we'll tackle the housing question, which is, I think, more of a geographic scope question. Let's start with cooling corridors.
Okay. The other one is easier.
Jump off the cliff.
So thank you, Councilor Rosenthal, for your question about cooling corridors. The scope is really broad. It is both but we want to start out with a basis of information on what that builds from the heat mapping work that our Data Resource Center has already done, and then brings in information that is really global in how to design cities in a way that that can be more climate resilient. And so it's both connecting those corridors and ensuring, understanding where the tree canopy gaps are. And so this is really an exploratory effort that we'll know a lot more after we've done the work to gather the information. And we have a draft scope. We will want to come back to council and get a little bit more feedback on what goes into that scope, where we can hear your ideas as well.
Okay, great.
Do you want me to answer?
Yes, please.
Okay. So for the regional housing coordination strategy right now, our requirement from the state is that we're coordinating the cities that are within the metro urban growth boundary. It doesn't mean that we won't have that we couldn't have conversations with other cities like Woodburn or Newburgh or Banks or North Plains, but that's not part of our requirement by the state law. We will be coordinating with them as we bring the information to you all for the 2024 urban growth management decision, as we're understanding how much of future population and job growth will go within our boundary and will go into our surrounding communities. So there will be a lot of conversations, but The regional housing coordination strategy will be focused within our urban growth boundary.
Okay, thanks.
Counselor Lewis.
Sure, thank you. I have just a few questions. One follow-up on the cooling corridors. Is that a standalone investment or will it be matched by additional tree canopy and cooling investments through Parks and Nature? Maybe that's for the COO.
Could you repeat that for me?
Is the cooling corridor a standalone or is it matched or in coordination with tree canopy investments in Parks and Nature?
I think the idea is to align kind of our, let me back up. I think we will be receiving information hopefully through the cooling corridor that tells us things like where are our existing cooling corridors? And I think my thinking was we would then be able to match that or overlay it with our target areas in our protect and restore maps and see if we are lined up or see if maybe it adds additional areas or adds additional importance to in our tiering system to certain areas. So I don't think we know quite yet how that will, come together, but I think we have a vision for this information feeding into other parts of Metro, whether it's the 2040 vision or the parks maps that we have. Did that
Great.
answer your question?
I think it makes sense to have both sides. I'm just curious if the 200,000 is the full investment for this time, or if we're gonna see a second presentation from Parks and Nature with additional resource.
Thank you. No, we, for now, this is the full amount that it encompasses, but I think that as we receive that data, we may find other paths for investment that we want to explore. I will say that I just read last night, an article about how climate adaptation really has to happen at the local level. They talked about tree canopy, and I'm really excited that this is not just tree canopy, but looking at, the contours of our geography and our habitat and how those things all flow together, literally flow with wind, to keep our region cooler.
And what surfaces we put down. Yes.
Yeah.
It's all connected. So I think this is the right investment. And I'm glad there's that coordination with Parks and Nature. I guess I will just also underscore there is a table that has been put together already doing some of this with some federal folks connected to it. And I would hope that we would have capacity to go to that table that was originally convened by Congressman Earl Blumenauer. Then I wanted to ask a question about the commitment to last mile. For 3 years now, Clackamas County has anxiously been awaiting the conclusion of RTP so that we could take advantage of a long promised study. Is this that study, and will last mile also include modeling of local shuttles or circular routes to help connect community?
Yes, and yes. I can go into more detail if you want, but Allie Holmquist is leading the work now that she's completed the HCT study. Really excited to kick this off. And one of the early things we should probably do is come spend a little time with you and talk about who we should be engaging with to make sure we're scoping it right. But it does include those elements.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And then I have one last question connected to our TOD. And I guess when I think about the reason why TOD lives in your department and not over in our housing department is because we are building commercial, and that includes levels of affordability. But our goal is to make investments that activate sites 24/7. And that requires, by necessity, a commercial level of development. What are kind of your next steps other than highlighting the deep affordability that you've bent the program to achieve? What are your next steps in investments in the program for TOD?
Why don't you take that and then I'll add a couple things.
Thank you, Counselor Lewis, for that question. We have our TOD group has been working with the Todd Steering Committee to define both a new strategic plan and now a work plan to implement the strategic plan. And so that's really the way that we are defining how to make future investments. And you're right, the commercial vibrancy that can be created with the Todd investments is one of the reasons that it continues to make sense for this program to be part of PDNR. We can't do our work without being connected with the housing department. And so we continue to work very closely with them throughout all of this. And as you might be aware, I think you're aware that the focus of the places where we're investing in TOD have always been transit focused. That's how we're able to use the federal money that we invest in the TOD program. It's transportation dollars, and we're able to make that case that it increases transit ridership. But the focus has changed over time from being just let's get some development around MAX stations to let's really focus on ground floor retail to affordable housing is one of the most important needs in our region. And so we have to bring affordable housing into the TOD program. And it could evolve in another 5 years to be, I don't imagine we will have solved our housing crisis in 5 years, but the TOD program may have some other elements that it brings in addition to that vibrancy and the affordable housing component that's near transit. So that's how I would answer your question.
Yeah, thank you. This is really repeating something you said, but our TOD work recognizes the criticality of housing's laser focus on getting people housed. We support that entirely. It's really about how we can use these federal funds in a way that helps also build economic vitality and stability over time. So things like a childcare facility as part of a housing development, all of which may or may not make sense for housing, which needs to retain that laser focus to be spending the time and energy on, but it's a great way for us to use those federal dollars. Does that answer your question?
It does, and you touched on something there. I just want to be really clear that when we think about the values of economic vitality, that also includes the workforce.
Yes.
And
Thank
we
you.
absolutely have to make sure that we're in alignment with the workforce goals that we have in our affordable housing development. And we've been really intentional there. So I don't want us to get crosswise.
Thank you.
That's really important. Then I also hope that we can continue to tell the story of making investments that do benefit the entire community. Social housing, I think, is the ultimate goal. Plentiful housing for people at all levels of affordability. So anything we can do there to tell that story and to model would be appreciated.
Thank you. And I know I'm not telling you all anything you don't know here, but one of the things that we've consistently heard from our experts who are coming to the Urban Growth Roundtable is that housing at every level, in particular workforce housing, is actually a critical piece of the puzzle in housing the unhoused, because the line between the unhoused and those lower levels of workforce housing is actually pretty porous. And so those investments matter a lot too. Yeah, thank you.
Great, let's go with Councilor Gonzalez and Nolan.
Thanks, Deputy President Wong. Well, I just really want to celebrate slide 10, which is the key equity metric that you presented, and the work that the department and the team has done to find structural ways to engage people of color in planning work. And I'm really proud of the growth, especially since FY22 and just seeing that. So Malou and Catherine, of course, into department leaders long into the past that helped kind of create the pathway for this. It makes me really proud, and I just want you to know that it's really wonderful that we've made that progress. I also feel really happy that the presentation showed a lot of Beaverton photos, so appreciate that. 2040 centers are looking really great. My primary thing that I wanted to bring up is around the 2040 regional vision conversation that we've had. I mean, ad nauseum, right? It's been a topic, and I feel, and I'm don't know where the council is, but I'm sure there would be a willingness. If how can we accelerate that project and that process, if it requires more funding or more direction, because I really feel like, our region is really hungry for a reset of our vision that includes a local plan on the barriers to closing our housing gaps, especially as many folks have mentioned. So my question is really, with the budget modifications that we see here, is this just an initial take on what is in the current work plan, and can it be accelerated if more resources are allocated to it? Thanks.
Thank you, Counselor, for the question. Couple of things. We really do need to get through the urban growth decision in order to free up staff to work on it. And I think it would take us just as long to get funding for and hire new staff and get them up to date. That said, we are already starting. We've identified some key staffing for the effort, and that group has already started meeting. We've done a little bit of early exploratory conversation with the COO's office as in terms of process, and with the DEI department in terms of process. What you see in the budget here is essentially the scoping dollars for us to start to really engage with you all and understand, kind of start to nail down what the priorities are and what the boundaries of the scope are, and honestly, what the magnitude of the refresh is. We've heard things from, we'll need 15 million for engagement. I loved how the eyebrows went up there to, it's just a small framework refresh. And we will need to find where in that scale we are and get agreement with you. So that said, if we find ourselves needing additional resources, we will come back to you. Obviously, we'll work with the COO's office and, make sure that that's an appropriate way to proceed. But I think at this point, we just need that early scoping to get our arms around what the effort is. But we'll be coming back to you sooner than later.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Counselor Gonzalez, can I get at your timing issue, your timing
Sure.
question a little
For
bit?
sure.
So we, it's really critical that by the time you're asked to make a decision on an urban growth management, that you have a really good, clear sense of what this 2040 update is going to look like. And so we anticipate starting that conversation with you in the next month or two to start the scoping. So don't think that because we're not asking for a larger amount of money right now that we're not beginning the work. We're ready to start that conversation and get your guidance on what it might look like, as Catherine described.
Okay. Great. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, good things take time. There's no secret. And I appreciate your comment about the staffing aspect and training. It's just the timeline, and it's been busy with RTP and now with the UGR. So, what is really, what helps me feel optimistic about the potentially slower timeline is that if we're really going to take this time to truly scope a process that could be, at a transformative level in terms of, I know that you floated the 15 million or a number of engagement at that scale. That is a significant rework that I'm supportive of over just a small technical update and refresh. Obviously, I know that those numbers can change, but I think if we're going to be looking at something on a much deeper level and a much deeper engagement, I'm more comfortable with the timeline. Albeit, it can be hard to be patient sometimes when there's clearly a need, and I think we all recognize how how aggressively we need to tackle that need, and when it comes to vision and narrative and reputation of our region. But anyway, I'm kind of giving you my commentary at this point, but I appreciate your feedback and look forward to continuing working with you on this. And again, if there's any resources that are necessary, I think we're happy to support a champion of that across all levels.
Counselor Nolan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation. Interesting work going on constantly. Earlier this fiscal year, last fall, in fact, when we were reviewing at the council level, the RTP, we had some questions, some discussions around the adequacy of our transportation model and an acknowledgement that it's evolving and it's improving every time, but that we were constrained by having to follow mandates from the state. And as I recall those conversations, we acknowledged that we had to do an analysis under the state's guidelines. That didn't preclude us from doing one under guidelines that were actually reflective of what's happening in reality instead of 10, 12 years ago, which the state relied on. And a discussion about we have to meet the deadlines, but we can make improvements later in the model to maybe do parallel projections if we still have to meet requirements from the state that are outdated. Is there someone in this budget funds to do those improvements to our model so that it more accurately uses data that reflects today's or very recent behavior, let alone potential improvements that would allow us to foresee or to predict taking that accurate data into future projections so that it can really guide us in decisions around some of our values on the transportation system?
Yes.
Let me tell me where it is, and we don't have to get into the wonky stuff.
I was going to
although some
say,
of my colleagues are wonks like I am.
thank you, Counselor. I'll try to keep it sort of mid-wonk level here. Our model can absolutely consider updated inputs. What we ran into at that point in the process with the RTP is that we were required to use the state's approach. The state's approach is being updated as well through the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking that's an admin code and rulemaking that's going through now. And our staff, including Kim Ellis, is deeply engaged in that and honestly leaning pretty hard on the state about the assumptions that are included. That's ongoing, deeply technical work. Happy to actually come back to you separately and talk about that, because I think there might be some insights that you could provide.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be great. With respect to our model, again, we're continuing, as we always do, to improve and run the model. It's considered the best in the country. We are proud of that. We will continue to try to keep that standard. The piece that might be in the middle here is how we analyze the impacts of certain projects even outside the model, how we set at the JPAC table requirements for projects that they meet certain regional policy goals, and then honestly how we hold to those requirements. And so there's a political element as well as a technical element, and that's the work that we'll be engaged in, are already, will continue to. So it's baked into the transportation and the MPO work for sure. By the time we are looking at projects for the 2028 RTP update, the climate analysis question should be resolved. And that'll be the moment where we all look at each other around the JPAC table and say, okay, if we are going to apply these, it means we're going to advance different projects. And that is partly, it's certainly partly Metro work. It's Metro Council work, it's Metro staff work, and it's also our regional partners work. So it's all in there. It just isn't a tidy body of work that says fix the model. The problem actually isn't the model, but the way we apply the model, the way we meet the state requirements, and the way we move projects forward based on what the model tells us about them.
And I appreciate that it is not just a calculation that results in an answer.
Yes.
But having acknowledged that, and it's important for you to do that, have you considered whether there is anything in your resources available to that work
Yes.
that we could improve the clarity of the information, the timeliness of it for those political and policy discussions? I don't want us to be
Yeah.
to shortchange ourselves
Yeah. I
in being
appreciate-
able to have accurate, useful information that can be hashed
Yes.
in the policy discussions.
I really appreciate the reminder that this is important to council, and I don't think that we have a resource problem per se around that particular piece of work. But it is a question of the regional cohesion that we can pull together, both technically and politically. So I think the resources are there, and we will continually need pressure from our partners in the community and from you all to help make sure that the resources get to the result that you're asking for. It's not a budget
Okay,
problem,
I'm happy to comply.
I'm sure. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, another, if I can shift a little bit, on your performance measures and your equity measure. Can we bring that slide back up, Connor? You had two performance measures, one of which seemed to me more a mechanical thing and not really a results measurement.
Connor, that's slide 9.
Thanks. One of the measures was a number of projects completed. And that doesn't tell me if we've changed the impacts on anybody's life or business, which is what I think at our level, at the council level of budget discussion and policy discussion is where we should be. You could complete 100 projects
Yeah,
and move the dial
Yeah.
maybe a half a point in the right direction, maybe 2 points in the wrong direction. And it doesn't tell me whether we are closer to our climate values and our equity values and our regional prosperity values. So at your level
yeah,
or at your manager's level, that may very well be a useful measurement of steps necessary to get to the results we're looking at. But it's not sufficient to get to the results we're looking at unless there's something about how we're affecting lives. So this is a plea to you and to Marisa
yeah,
that at the council level, we be discussing and advising and directing how the investments we make impact people's lives in the direction of the values and missions that we've set.
maybe
Just
I
for
could,
contrast, if I might, the density one, I think has real potential to get there. Because if we are making TOD investments, we can then measure.
Yeah.
Is the actual developed density of that area better than it, closer to full capacity of the existing zoning, for example?
Yeah.
Or more than 1.5 times the regional average along transportation corridors. So we're getting the improvement we want. So can you talk a little bit about how you can get closer to something that everybody can see and that it is the effect outside those windows? The people who don't know who Metro is, are we improving their lives?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It makes me think that we need to better articulate what multimodal projects mean. In this context, the way we have intended that is to mean projects that provide a different kind of mobility for people from driving. So walking, bicycling, and transit, and the ability to move with assistive devices. Those are really what we have in mind, and we haven't spelled that out there.
Well,
We could, and maybe just to go a little bit further, one thing we could put there as a measure would be a system completeness measure. When we look at transportation system investments over the past 75 years, they have focused on completion of the auto system. And one way to more accurately do this would be to look at how close are we getting in our communities to more complete systems for other means of getting around. Would that get closer to what you're talking about?
it would, and I like the way you're going. In my mind, equity is not just about, are we advancing investments toward full completion of the transit and pedestrian and bike system, so much as is the balance of our investments, since we're already at 95% or whatever we are of the internal combustion or motor vehicle system, and I can't remember the number, but it's less than 50% toward transit. Are we investing enough so that this catches up? Not just that this one goes half the distance to the goal, half the distance to the goal from 95 and half the distance from the goal from 50 means they'll never catch up.
Yeah.
So, but it's definitely closer.
Let us take it back and work on it with this
Thank
input.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
And can we go to the next slide then?
Before we move on, could I just ask a clarifying question? Sure. Councilor Nolan, are you looking for the people measure, as in, not just the number of projects, but the number of people who now have access to multimodal modes of transportation? Because that could also connect to demographics and things like that.
I'm interested in that, and I also acknowledge the limitations of the data we have. So I'd be inclined to defer to Catherine and her team about that, but I think you understand that I'm focused on results that people can count on.
Yeah.
Access to affordable, safe transit, commuting and things like that. I'd like to see it, if we had any way of doing it, by quartile, because if we get to equity.
It's just thinking about a map.
We had elsewhere in your presentation last mile. In the district I represent, there aren't very many last mile issues. There are in other parts of the region.
Right.
But in the district I represent, there are definitely income disparities that transit has actually been reduced in some parts of the district, even though the neighborhoods are densifying with housing. So we've reduced low to moderate income access to transit while we're building additional lanes and things for people who can afford to commute by car. And my understanding, what I'm advocating for is that our climate as well as our racial equity values say that we should go the other way.
Thank you.
And I'd like an ability for us to track it and say, yeah, it's making a difference. Or, oh, we thought that would be useful, but 2 years later, it hasn't been. Maybe then we go back and say, you professionals, you experts, should we be measuring something else?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good discussion, and I think we can take this back and come up with some other ideas to change, to keep the general concept, but make it more people oriented.
And Marisa, may I move to this slide now?
Thank you.
This one, I think, again, is a necessary step. It's a really important step for us to extend voice, include more voices in decision-making and review and recommendations. But I don't think it's sufficient to get to racial equity, because we can benefit from the wisdom of maybe a couple hundred BIPOC leaders, which is a good thing to measure and a good thing to do. But measuring complete success is, does it result in better affordability, better access, better climate conditions because we're not running heavy duty traffic through low income and BIPOC neighborhoods? So this is a good start. I agree with Councilor Gonzalez that this is something to be proud of, but it doesn't get us all the way there.
Agreed.
Thanks.
Another round, let's go with Councilor Lewis, then Rosenthal.
Sure, thank you. Picking up on the conversation around performance indicators and the metrics that we use in budget decision. I think that Metro is going above and beyond when it comes to making sure that we are investing in planning. Just in 5.5 years, 6 years, wherever I am. I've been part of planning for 2 bike ped bridges in my district. Neither of them, I think optimistically, will be built while I'm still in office. So the gap there between really good plans and execution, I don't think we're seeing, and that might be part of Councilor Nolan's concern, because we are counting those planning projects and we did nice planning. But the funds, the political will, and some of the technical details just make it such that we're not going to be realizing that system of bike ped network anytime soon. So I think that's a place where I want to see us actually focus on what's actually happening, not just where are our investments making plans that don't come to fruition.
Thank you, Councilor. Actually, that metric was intended to count what is built,
Okay.
not what is
The way it
planned.
was phrased made it look like
Okay.
it was all of our investments.
Okay, yeah, we can work on that too, because I agree with you. Without measuring what's actually done is less impactful.
Thanks.
And I agree with you that there's a gap between planning and implementation, which tracks back to many things, including local priorities and money. But there's work we can do there too. But there's no way to reflect that that work was successful unless the thing is built.
Yep.
Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Chair. Councilor Nolan brought up the issue of the RTP, and there were several things. There are some of us that voted for the RTP, not because we liked it. I didn't, but because we had to, because it needed to be passed. But I would point out that there were 3 elements that were identified as areas for potential amendment. One was the reuse of the model. The other one was adding criteria that had something to do with climate, and then adding criteria that had something to do with safety, which was not, basically they were not highly integrated into the current project list. And so I would be disappointed if we waited until 2028 to amend or to modify the RTP, because I think those needs were identified now and are much more pressing. However, they do have to wait until we do a 2040 refresh. So there is an interesting timing issue. That's just a comment. I don't think you don't need to respond on that. On a slightly larger scale, I just have to say, I mean, I'm sometimes awestruck at the kind of work and the amount of work that this department does, because it covers there's a lot of balls in the air, and there are a lot of different concepts that have to be balanced, and they're not always very equitable. That said, I just have to put on record that I was not comfortable when initially we merged information systems with planning, and that we have merged planning with transportation. I will probably never be comfortable with that particular alignment, because I think they're very different concepts and require very different skills. So I appreciate the work that is being done to keep them all, juggling together, but I would be happier if we had 3 separate departments.
Okay, great, thank you. I have 2 questions for myself, just kind of continuing on the line of questioning on modeling. And I think we're focused on the RTP context, but I've heard of challenges with projections and things like that on some of our transit projects as well. That might impact interstate bridge or high capacity transit projects. And I'm wondering if that's is that a separate modeling issue, or is that all kind of part of the same model? And then, I think our models go on to serve different purposes, but are we spending the proper amount of resources to meet the various needs where our data and modeling goes to advance kind of our goals? Because we're basing all our decisions and funding, potential on these models. So just want to clarify that's different models or the same model, and are we taking care to meet the expectations of our potential funders?
Thank you for that question. We have both the modeling team and the RTP implementation team. The modeling team led by Matt Bin, and the RTP implementation team led by Tom Kloster and Kim Ellis, looking at the RTP model questions. And I do think that in the context of some of the project conversations, questions have arisen about how we model transit, and we're not going to be able to avoid those questions or ignore them. I don't think that's a resource problem, similar to how I responded to Councillor Nolan's question. That is bringing the model forward, continuing to update it, continuing to take what is a mixture of art and science and keep it state of the art. So, and the teams are acutely aware of the need to do that and working on that. So I don't think that's a resource question. I also think the question about how Metro engages with project teams for major projects, that's a little bit more of a resource question, but that's not the problem right now. It is
separate models. Is it
they
one model goes to transit?
They are separate issues based on different kinds of modeling work that Metro does. We do a certain type of modeling work for our own internal RTP, and then as a consultant, our modeling team does work that serves the basis of project submittals to the federal government, for example. It is the same model. It's different applications of that model. And as I say, the teams are acutely aware of needing to address these issues. And it's not really a funding issue. It is changing of circumstances over time and need to continually progress as we think about how we measure or project. I don't know, Malou, if you want to add anything else there.
Thank you, Catherine. I think that 2 things I would add. One is our modeling team is continually working to bring in more resources that can be applied to projects like the transit projects that we're working on. We have a new staff person who's learning how to run the model that the Federal Transit Administration runs and requires. That's not capability that we've had in the past. It's called the STOPS. I'm not going to be able to remember the acronym, but so we will soon have the ability to both use our regional model, which we need to be able to do. It's the same model as the RTP. We'll also be able to run STOPS, which is what the Federal Transit Administration uses. So we are working to update within the resources that we have. The other thing that I would just add is the research program director is someone who could be a spokesperson in some of these places to help elevate some of the issues and also just firm up the validity of the work that we do. And so that is a missing, it's a missing resource that we haven't had. And so that's just one way that that person could be deployed. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, we all know how important this is for the RTP and all our planning work. So I'll trust your judgment on that.
And it does suggest to me there might be a need for some conversations outside of the budget context on some of these things that are rising up. So I just know that we're filing that away, and feel free to reach out to us and we'll think about how to reach back to you when there's meaningful ways to communicate.
Great, thank you. My second question kind of relates to the overall budget. And I see that we're increasing our general fund allocation to the department. I also see that we're also getting more federal grants, which is great. We're excited about that. But can you help explain why we're getting more outside dollars, but also having to put in more general fund dollars? And then also, is that sustainable? Is that like, saw a pretty big increase in general fund investment? Is that going to continue over time?
Yeah.
Is that going to, create tensions with other parts of the agency? Just wanted to have a longer forecast about why there's this bump, and then
Yeah.
why we're also getting federal grants, but not.
That's a great question, Counselor Wong. So we do have a lot more in federal grants, which is always, of course, fantastic. What that does often mean, though, is then we have more work. We have new work, right? And so as you heard Catherine present, we have 2 proposed new positions in next year's budget that are funded by federal grants. Those are new people we were bringing out. So we have that new funding, but now we're hiring these new staff. So that's one of the ways that we're using some of that new funding. Some of that new funding does go to some existing staff, but I think that's what we find a lot of times. Or, for example, the work that we're doing on 82nd Avenue and TV Highway and those transit corridors, we have had to increase our staff capacity to be able to move forward on those projects. We recognized during our 5-year forecast in the fall of this year that we were going to need to make this, we've been calling it a reset in general fund allocation to imply that it was going to be a big bump, but this would be a one-time big bump, then we'll need to stay at that level, but we don't forecast that we're going to need another big bump through that 5-year forecast period. And I would say that it is really because of the reduction that we had in our allocation during the pandemic. I know that feels like a long time ago, 4 years ago, right? But we did have lower costs immediately after the pandemic. We reduced our staffing, central services reduced our staffing, so our cost allocation plan went down. And we then had, because our costs were lower, we had some grant carryover. So that was able to sustain us then in the next couple of years as we started adding staff back up. And then it was this fall that we really saw like, okay, now this is going to become an issue. And through coordination with the finance department and our COO's office, we were able to really like focus in on like, what is that amount we would need to get to a new like standard general fund allocation level that will sustain us into the future. So that's really what this does. I don't expect that you'll see an increase like this again in the next few years. I'm sure there will be asks for new work. I mean, we heard some talk in the budget notes, right? There's a lot of new work that our department could do. There might be some one-time asks, but this really feels like a reset that I wouldn't expect we would bring forth again.
So it's your understanding then that this is a sustainable way of structuring the department for years to come.
Exactly.
Great.
Deputy
Okay, sounds
President
good.
Wong, I can also add some context kind of overall to how we use general fund at Metro. Most of Metro's funds are restricted, as you know. We have a relatively small general fund compared to other organizations. And so we are very judicious in the way that we distribute that to departments. When I make my series of budget decisions to accept or reject budget modifications and decide how to dole out the general fund, we separate one-time only general funds and ongoing general funds that we could sustain over a period of years. And so we had relatively modest requests for general fund resources this year with some notable exceptions. And we also have a healthier general fund than we have had in a couple of years. And so this felt like the right time to reset the levels of general fund that are supporting the planning department. The other department that receives a general fund allocation or a larger one is Parks and Nature. And we have been gradually bringing them back up to pre-pandemic levels as well. But I just wanted to provide some context for how we're weighing those things. These are general fund dollars are the most discretionary, flexible dollars that we have at Metro, and so we try to tend to them carefully. Brian, if you want.
That I completely agree with everything Marisa shared. I think the other thing to note is that when we talk about sustainability, we're typically looking over our 5-year planning horizon. And the thing to remember is this is not at all unique to Metro, but pretty common across most governments is that most of our revenue sources, in our case, our discretionary general fund comes from the solid waste excise tax. There's a mechanism in the Metro Code that limits the growth of that to basically around the rate of inflation. And as Rachel mentioned, most of our costs in planning and development, just like most of our departments, are personnel. Personnel costs tend to rise at faster than the rate of inflation. So we have some built-in tension there. And I think Councillor Wong, you're exactly right that as we, kind of go down the road, 3 or 4 years from now, there will be in a place where there'll be tension between our demands for general fund and our ability to fund that. Based on our 5-year forecasting, we're not projecting that, we won't have a dire situation. We believe we can afford these choices, but some of our, 3, 4, 5, 6 years from now, I think some of our flexibility is going to be constrained as we deal with the kind of the divergence of those lines, our costs and our revenues.
And is there a special pool of resources we pull from for like the federal match for grants, or does that always come from general? It's like we want to get federal dollars, but we're actually taking from our general fund.
This is universally true. There is no special pot of money for funding the things we want to do, and no, it's general fund.
Okay. Right. So then there's like a natural barrier where we are not going to be as competitive for federal grants if we don't have that general fund match. Is that something that we're seeing as a phenomenon?
I'll let planning speak to the extent to which that is a kind of a constraint that we expect to see. I mean, I think I'll say from the finance perspective, we have other tools we could employ if that did become a constraint. I'm not aware of that having been a constraint in the now or in the recent past.
Okay.
Counselor, maybe I could just follow up on that and say that the reset that Rachel is describing gets us to a place where the FTE, the staff, the work can move forward without being compromised. But the one-time requests you see are more in line with what we would expect for grant match. And while they're not small, they are relatively modest compared to Metro's budget overall. So if we have the ability to come and ask for that type of one-time request, I don't think our competitiveness for federal grants is impacted now.
Okay.
Assuming the reset is something that is supported.
Great. Thank you so much. Great. Well, thank you so much for the presentation and all the hard work going into the budget.
Great, thank you all.
Okay, let's move on to Chief Operating Officer Communications. Any
Thank you.
updates?
Just one update today. I wanted to preview for you what our agenda is for our fourth stakeholder advisory table on affordable housing, our meeting tomorrow. The first half of the meeting is going to be dedicated to the counties presenting information on their current service levels and answering questions about their commitments. We have collected questions from our stakeholders, provided those to the counties, and also added some of our own as well. So we're looking forward to those presentations tomorrow. The second half of the meeting is going to be focused on really drilling down on the areas of alignment that have emerged in the conversation. So at the last meeting, stakeholders were able to build their own scenarios for the uses of the supportive housing services tax. We found a lot of alignment, not unanimity, but alignment in some big areas. And so we've taken that information to create 3, what we're calling trending scenarios. These are still just for discussion purposes, but to give the group a sense of what the trade-offs are of different policy choices, so that they can advise us on their opinions on those and what the impacts in their communities and their constituencies would be. So the hope is that, and we've also, for those trending scenarios, produced some sample outcomes with our external consultants. So outcomes in the form of units of housing created by different trending scenarios. So we're hoping that in combination with the outcome information, the information from the counties, that the stakeholder table will then be able to let us know whether any of that changes their thinking. They'll have an opportunity to revise the scenarios that they worked on last time. And then we'll once again gather up that information and see where we are. So it should be a really interesting meeting, interactive, and we look forward to seeing all our partners there. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank
you.
Simple question. What time?
It is at noon tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. And then we have counselor communications. Any counselor communications? No. All right. Oh, Counselor Rosenthal.
Counselor Gonzalez.
Counselor Gonzalez.
Great, for sure. Yeah, I think I posted on social, so I think most of y'all saw, but was able to attend the ribbon cutting ceremony for the Opal in Cedar Mill, which is one of the newest affordable housing projects that's opening in the region. It's dedicated to senior affordable housing with a specific program, wraparound services, partnerships to support LGBTQ+ seniors. 54 units of affordable units again out in Cedar Mill. It was really wonderful. And it was one of the projects where the local United Methodist Church actually donated the land and was able to help that project come to fruition. During that ceremony afterwards, some of the folks from the church came up and they just said, hey, we have a lot more plots around the region. Bring the money, and we want to do this. We want to keep doing this. So it was a great moment where public sector, faith, community groups were able to come together to deliver a really special project, and definitely something I hope we can keep supporting. And I know y'all feel it too in your hearts. So I'm hoping that we can continue finding resources to make these projects come into fruition. Thanks.
Thank you. Counselor Rosenthal.
Just a brief note that I was able to attend the Home Plate Gala fundraiser last Friday, and they have a shelter, a drop-in shelter for homeless youth in Beaverton, and I think it's very important that we support this because it keeps people from getting in the habit of basically living on the streets. And we have supported the home plate development back when it was in planning phase and then it was opened. And there were quite a few people attended. It was a pretty successful event.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, seeing no further discussion, the council work session is adjourned and our next regular meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, April 23rd, 2024 at 10:30 a.m. Thank you all.